Hi, welcome again. Today I'm going to make a stained glass LED ball using capiz shells. So this is going to be a light up ball that you can use for outdoor Christmas decorations. And I've added some links to this so that you can buy the stuff if you'd like to, if you're interested, from my Amazon affiliates. So first of all, I draw the size of the ball that I want to use. I did this on graph paper so I could try to make it symmetrical. And then I started cutting pieces of wire. I'm using 12 gauge, half hard wire so that this will not flex a lot while I'm working. This is also a circle that I'm going to be using at the top. I need to have an opening at the top so that I can get the LED lights to fit inside. I have a board that I made, and I do have a video showing how to make a board that's really easy and inexpensive that I can use push pins to hold my project on. And I have a translucent silicone layer on the board, and underneath that translucent silicone is another little graft of some circles, some symmetrical circles with some rays going out, so I can help use that as I'm soldering this together to try to keep it symmetrical and, look like a ball. So here I am attaching my wires that I have bent and trying to get them to cooperate and lie where I want them to. And then I'm using some thumbtacks and using them to hold them in place before I start soldering. Now I'm going to do a new video coming up where I'm taking these push pin thumbtack things and coating them with silicone so that when you're soldering, you can actually solder right up to one of the pins and it won't actually solder the pin to your project, which you might not really want. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to hold them in place while I'm soldering. So I got these wire, these brass rings, and I'm going to use one of those at the bottom. So right now you're looking at the bottom of the project. And I'm going to use one of these wire circles to hold everything together at the bottom. I also have some duct tape that I'm using to help hold stuff together. And yeah, this is my first round Christmas ball that I'm making. So it's probably not as perfect as ones will be in the future. At least I'm hoping that I can improve over time. So I'm using little clips, anything I can find to help hold stuff together. Now, of course, another thing is to try to hold things together while you're soldering without burning your fingers. I mean, there's a lot of different things you need to try to figure out how to do when you're making these creations. So I'm like going, okay, at the bottom I want it on that array, but at the top it's gotta go to the center. So it's like, okay, what should I tack together first to get this thing to hold together? Yeah, it's kind of tilty and fun. So now I got my solder iron out. I'm using some used solder. As you can see, those globs of solder, those are from old projects that are just left over, and they're really easy to grab a small piece of solder instead of trying to get it off of a coil. I'm using an old pair of pliers to help hold it because, as I said, it's going to be very hot because you've probably noticed that since copper conducts the temperature and the heat really quickly, you don't want to hold it for very long without, pliers or gloves or something because it will get hot. So if you're going to do like I'm doing right now, do it quickly. And then I'm soldering a little bit more aggressively at the base of it. Hopefully that if I solder one side quite well, then the side that I just tacked together will cooperate and stay on. So I have that at the bottom that I want to kind of sturdily solder there. So I'm using pliers now to hold that part together. Now, a lot of these solder globs at the bottom are kind of swimming in flux. I'm using a gel flux, so I don't have to flux everything that I'm doing. I can use the flux that's already in the solder that's kind of swimming on my work table there. But it does help if I put fresh flux on it. That yellow thing in the corner is my exhaust so that it's actually, I have it attached to a hose to go outside so that I can, get the fumes away from my work. So I work right underneath that little exhaust sucker. Okay, I'm soldering some more sections on, as you can see. And one of these, that one in the bottom, it just didn't end up being as long as some of them. As I said, this is my first circle and it's not perfect. But that's okay. So that one I decided I'm just going to attach it to the outside. It's not going to go all the way to the center of the bottom. And sometimes you have to like bend the wires so that they fit more like you want them to. Like right now I have to bend it a little bit more so it's flatter right there. Okay, so now I got that attached. See if I can hold it somehow. I wish I had 6 hands, but I don't. So there it goes. So that one is attached. That's why I'm using a copper ring or a copper or brass ring. I think actually this one is a brass ring because both copper and brass take solder really easily. So that's why at the top there, it's soldered really quickly. So yeah, if you want to use a different kind of metal for your project besides copper or brass, just work with it first to make sure that it will take the solder easily, and also use bare copper or bare brass. You don't want to get something that says that it's treated to prevent rusting, because yeah, it's kind of nice that it's not going to rust, but if it has a coating on it to prevent the rusting, it probably will not take the solder as easily. You might have to like scrape off the or sand off the coating that's on it. Okay, so now I'm trying to do the last piece of this puzzle. So it didn't really want to move, so I had to actually heat up the base again, and which is actually the top, but I had to heat that up and then to move that section over a little bit. That particular circle doesn't really, even if I bend it down, it never really wanted to attach right there, which was okay because I had so many other arrays of this attached that that little one that didn't want to attach, and I obviously didn't want to solder it to my pliers either, didn't really affect it that much. So now I'm just going to go around and just make sure everything is, yes, attached as good as possible. Now I've washed my my little ball with, I used some Dawn dishwashing detergent and scrubbed the flux, even though it's water soluble flux. I do use soap also to get it clean. I'm using capiz shell and using a pencil, drawing out where I want to cut. And most of the shells that you buy will have a hole already put in them, as you can see, because they're usually used as making wind chimes, and people like to have a hole in them. So a lot of them will come already with at least one, sometimes two holes. And these are a whole bunch of different pieces that I've cut for other projects and foil. This is a larger capiz shell, and so they come in usually in a couple different sizes, and I'm using the small ones when I can, but a lot of the time I have to use the large ones. And I'm just cutting the bottom straight because I decided I'm going to actually fill in. At one point I was thinking that I would have irregular shapes and have spaces between the shells, but then I decided, no, I'm just going to fill in the whole shell, the whole ball with shells, and just do it that way. And I made a circle at the top. Now I'm going to solder as best I can this first bunch of shells, this first array of shells. I've used like little globs of duct tape underneath it. You can see some of them to hold it together in place while I'm putting the flux and the solder on for the first layer. So I'm not worrying about if I can fill every single gap because I'll take care of that later. I'm just trying to get it to all stay together. So sometimes I use this brand new piece of solder like I'm doing right now, and at times I use the globs from other projects, whatever seems to make it easier. Oh, sorry, my hand's kind of in the way right there. Okay, so I'm fluxing when I need to, and then using solder to just fill and attach every piece to the wire armature that I made. So yeah, even though the duct tape is holding stuff in place, you may need to reassess where something's going to go as you go along. Nothing is going to be perfect. So these little clamps like I just used, they come in they come very handy to clamp here and there, and they're easy to use, they're not expensive, and they're very handy. So after I am done soldering the top, I took off all those little pieces of duct tape, and now I am adding solder. Oh, that one's loose, it looks like, so I may have to attach that one back together. But adding solder to the inside so that I can hold it together as best as possible, because by the time I'm done, it's going to be kind of hard to get way down to the bottom of my sphere to do this. So that's why I'm doing it now. So I'm just keep turning it around and soldering where I can to hold stuff together. And if you have a gap that doesn't seem to, it's a little bit too big to make your solder stay, let that area cool down some, and then try to get a glob of solder that's a little bit cool, like hanging off the end of your solder iron, and then just kind of drop it in place, and that'll usually fill the gap if it's just a small gap. But as I said, I'm not too worried about the gaps. I'm going to take care of those later. But if there's one that's just, just a little bit showing, you might want to just fill it now with some somewhat cold solder. And obviously, once you've heated up one area with soldering, that solder is going to be very hot, and you're not going to be able to add an extra cold solder glob to that, because it's just going to dissolve and kind of blend in with the rest of the solder immediately. And if it's a hole, it's just going to go straight through your project onto your silicone mat. Yeah, feel free to zoom in if you want a closer picture of this, but it's not all that exciting. I'm not doing like perfect smooth soldering seams. I'm just trying to fill the gaps and hold it together. Yeah, that little piece right there was kind of a problem because it's a little bit, um, it's kind of sticking out. I end up cutting that off later on. I think I ended up using like wire cutters and just cutting that piece a little bit smaller because it just was not cooperating. So right now so you can see those globs that fell through cracks when I did the back soldering. So I'm smoothing those off. See, yep, right there. I'm smoothing those off and using that solder to smooth out the seam. And as you can see, some of the excess solder will just kind of fall on the mat, but that's okay. I will use that sometime. No solder is wasted. You do not want to heat up the foil around the shells for very long because it will start deattaching itself to the rest of the project. I'm using such a thin piece of foil that if you heat it up too much, it'll it'll just kind of detach itself because the foil has a limited amount of stickiness to it. And you can see me foiling a piece. I'm using 3mm foil here. It's really nice because it's already the thickness that I want for this project. Now, at times in the past, I have shown you how I can take the regular 7/32 inch foil and cut it to the desired width. So a lot of times I would take a piece and cut it in like thirds for what I'm doing right now, but it's just so darn handy to just buy it thinner to begin with, if you can get it, and then you don't have to do all the cutting. And whenever you foil, of course, you do need to smooth and press down the foil into your project that you are foiling because you are counting on the stickiness of the foil to help hold your piece in place once you solder it. So this is where I'm using the duct tape to hold the pieces together. And I just make sure when I am soldering that I don't actually melt the duct tape into the solder. I have to just solder kind of near it, but not really near it, and then take the duct tape off before I actually do that area because I do not want any of the remaining duct tape stickiness to actually remain in my project. So here you can see I'm using a large piece of capiz shell. And still, even with a large piece, I can't use that much of it because of the curvature of the ball. I have to still cut it. Now, for cutting the capiz shells, I'm using just regular, ordinary scissors. You don't have to use like tin snips or anything like that. It's pretty thin material, and especially if you come from both sides of a large cut like this, and if it won't break in the middle, you can just bend it back and forth and then kind of smooth it out with your scissors afterwards. So I usually cut a piece, make sure it's actually the size I want, and then put the foil on it. And this is a scrap that I had from one of the larger capiz shell like I just showed you, and I am using it as a piece. I do like to keep all the larger scraps of the shells for other projects. When I'm doing my capiz feathers, like I have a video on the feathers, I like to use smaller scraps for the different parts of the feathers. If the foil overlap does not meet perfectly and you're concerned about that, you can use a mat knife, usually a small mat knife, and cut some of the foil to make the overlap meet perfectly. Or you can do like I'm doing right now and just kind of push in the one that's too fat. So, yep, another one done. So I need to solder the remaining parts that I just put on. So I'm going to be using my solder iron again. And you can see that I actually did put some foil around the top on the outside to kind of cover the seams. But I'm going to solder these parts now. Again, at the beginning, I'm just going to tack them together because I want to get rid of that duct tape, and I don't want to melt the duct tape into my seams. So at the beginning, I'm not going to do like a lot of soldering. I'm just going to try to make it all stay together. That part around the circle right there, I did put a piece of foil, as I said, around it because there was a lot of cracks. So there, I don't have any duct tape, so I could add more solder right there. You can see there's still some pretty big gaps. The next step, I will take care of those gaps. But before that, I want to solder them as much as possible before I have to fool around with trying to cover the gaps. So right there, you could see that there was a gap I was trying to fill with solder, and it just did not want to fill. So I will have to cover that up. That's okay. Now I'm going to use copper foil to fill the gaps. So I'm going to be using probably my 3mm copper foil, but there may be times when I'll have a wider gap that I'll need to fill. But so I'm going to take my copper foil and just stick it over and on top of any of these gaps. Because yes, I could fill them with solder, using that technique I talked about with waiting till it's really cool and then dropping kind of colder solder on top of it. But it's gonna take quite a while and lots of extra globs of solder. But adding copper foil over the cracks that I have will really make it much easier. And I use this technique on a lot of my projects if I have gaps that I need to fill up. So of course you'll have to have your project clean. So you'll want to use soap and water, and you'll want it dry before you add foil, because the foil will not stick to something that's slimy or wet. So it has to be ready. And then you will want to press down your foil just like you would if you just used um, a new piece of shell. You want to press it down really thoroughly, because once you heat it up, it's going to have to rely on that stickiness in order to stay on your project. And if it's not stuck down, you'll just end up with a piece of foil that has solder on it, and it will no longer be attached to your project. Now around the top there where I left it open to put the LED lights in, there was quite a lot of gaps right there. And if you made this out of stained glass, like a sheet of stained glass, you're going to have very similar issues in that stained glass is flat, even flatter than capiz shells, and having gaps is going to be almost impossible not to do, because the flat surfaces will not want to go around a circle like a ball really easily unless you use a lot of really small pieces of glass. So you may have to do this technique of adding foil to cover up gaps that you've created. Now I've also decided that I want to add some decoration with some more stripes. So instead of making a lot of small pieces originally with the shells, I am actually adding some stripes on top of the shells. And you can do this with stained glass also. You can add details with solder, wire, foil, and then just add solder on top of that. And that's how a lot of people get the decorations that you might want. So not everything has to be a separate piece of glass or a separate piece of shell in this example. So I decided I wanted to break up these shells because they're already kind of broken up into hexagons and squares and rectangles and lots of different shapes. But I decided I wanted to break them up a little bit more, because I mean, it is a Christmas ball. It needs to have some fun to it. So sometimes I'm using a couple layers so that the stripes are different widths. It's completely up to you. And again, you need to push them all down because you don't want them to come up when you're soldering. And when you are soldering these stripes especially, you will want to do it quickly. You don't want to add a lot of heat because you don't want them to come up again when you are soldering. So now I'm going to solder the remaining foil that I just put on. Now, if you do this all in one day or whatever, when you do it, if you wash it that day, like right when you're done, it'll get a lot cleaner than if you decide you're going to spend, a couple weeks making this project and you don't really want to wash it till it's done. Well, you're going to have a harder time getting the flux off. So you're better off, if you just want to do it for a while and not finish your project that day, if you go and wash your project, you'll have much better luck the next time when you come back. And then when you're done, you'll be able to get the flux off a lot faster. And especially with a project like this, is yes, you're going to want to scrub the flux off, but because you know that some of the foil is just attached on top, you're going to want to be pretty nice to those areas because they're not attached as well as the foil that's wrapped around the individual shells. So you're just going to want to be, extra special to those areas. And yes, once you put the solder on them, they're pretty sturdy, but still, you just, be careful. So I'm now adding solder to any area that has not been soldered yet. And I'm kind of looking over the whole project and making sure that everything is covered with solder. Now I could patina this in either a copper finish or a black finish. I decided just to leave this silver for this Christmas balls kind of silvery color is fine. But that's up to you. But putting solder on top of the foil, even if I was going to leave it and patina it in a copper color, having it soldered as opposed to just leaving the copper stripe will just be a lot stronger, and it'll make the copper stripes that I added blend in better with the copper seams. So you see I'm kind of using the solder as pliers, as I'm using it to kind of roll the ball around as I'm working. If you find your solder doesn't want to flow, then you probably need to add more flux to that area. If you want to know what those red circles are on the left side of this, they are my silicone washers that I use sometimes to hold a project in the air or something like a crystal in place. And I just had them there on the work surface in case I wanted to use them. So I like using my tweezers. The trouble with those tweezers is that they will solder right to my project, so I can't really, get them right there because they will start to, the solder will start to kind of attach themselves to the tweezers themselves, but they are handy. So now I bought this LED lights, and they are for outside for solar. We'll run them, and I uncoil them. They have 120 lights on this coil. And I have to undo all of them and then take these and shove them inside the cavity of the ball that I made. So you can see they're really, really pretty stuffed in there. So you don't want to buy too many lights on your string of lights or they won't fit into your project. So this is what it looked like when it's done. And thanks for watching.